Hello everyone, welcome back to Young Adult Materials, SLIS 757. It is week 12 of fall 2018. It is the week of November 11th. We are looking at poetry and novels in verse this week, so I hope to give you some good ideas and some good texts to use in the future. So here we go. So our learning outcomes this week include: you will learn about poetry and verse novels for young adults. You will learn about popular young adult poets, and you will learn about programming using poetry for young adults. Okay, so many young adults have a bad feeling about poetry because English teachers, and I'm guilty, tend to beat poetry with a stick, like a dead horse. Anyway, so they associate poetry with classrooms and with required readings. Some of the works of poetry among the titles on the best books for young adult lists are It's a Small Number Compared to Other Genres. So Reflections on a Gift of Watermelon Pickle by Dunning. American Sports Poems by Knudsen and Swenson. That is popular when I bring it out. When I point it out to kids, it's popular with them, particularly boys. The Place My Words Are Looking For, What Poets Say About and Through Their Poems by Janesco. Cool Salsa, Bilingual Poems on Growing Up Latino in the United States by Carlson. Class Dismissed by High School Poems by Glenn. I can't remember his first name. Anyway, that's popular in my library also, but that's getting very old. Something Permanent by Rylant. I think there's been a lack of popularity in the past for poetry, but I think it's changing. But I'll read you this quote by Ruth Gordon. So many people are afraid of it because of the form and its perceived formality. They have been taught to read incorrectly, and they are not taught how to read poetry for themselves. And this is quoted in our CART textbook, I believe. So this lack of popularity, I do think, is changing because kids are recognizing that many musical forms, including rap, are types of poetry. And I think people are writing more accessible poetry aimed at young adults, and it is trickling down a little bit. So I think there's some level of change. And the novel in verse has become much more popular. So I think students recognize that there is an accessibility to poetry that is enjoyable. And CART also quotes Paul Janesco. If poetry is to do more than furnish answers on a multiple choice test, we must relate poetry to the real world, finding poems that are connected with something that happened at school, in the community, or in the world. So changes to poetry programming and the concept of poetry and attitudes towards poetry began in the 90s. In 1986, Robert Penn Warren became America's first official poet laureate. In 1996, the Academy of American Poets, the ALA, and others started National Poetry Month in April. Public television and the internet focused on poetry or made poetry more accessible. Coffee houses started hosting open mic nights so people could come read their own original poetry. Also just increasing exposure, like the public's exposure to poetry in multiple forms. And YA librarians began including poetry programs in programming. That was a lot of programming, sorry. Anyway, and I will tell you, I didn't become a school librarian until 1999, but I started the library or poetry programming probably not until 2001. I started doing library programming or poetry programming in my library, but it was definitely right at the beginning of my career that I started pushing the poetry. And I think it had to do with the fact that there was National Poetry Month, and then it created a built-in programming opportunity for me as a librarian. I didn't have to think it's like, oh, April's National Poetry Month, so let's do something. So one way to celebrate National Poetry Month is to have your book talks be focused on novels in verse for National Poetry Month. That's just one aspect or one thing you could do. So you can check out the Yalsa Hub blog. If you would rather not attempt a sonnet, a haiku, or even a limerick, there's a great way to ease yourself into the world of poems, novels written in verse. The tales are so compelling and the verse so subtle, you won't even realize you're reading poetry. If you need suggestions for a Poetry Month display of verse titles, there's this Feedly link here from 2014 that can help you create a display. If you use Destiny at your library, or if you don't, you can probably search for novels in verse. I know Destiny can do it because I did it today just to double check. And you can search for novels in verse, and then you have a list of novels in verse to use in a display or to use for a book talk. That's a great way to introduce kids to novels in verse. Some of the early young adult verse novels. God Went to Beauty School by Cynthia Rylant from 2003. Keisha's House by Frost was a Prince Honor book. I will tell you that still circulates. It circulates only when I push it, when I get it out for novels in verse, but that still circulates in my library. Locomotion by Jacqueline Woodson, also from 2003, which also still circulates at my library if I get it out and push it. I have kids who ask for it afterwards. Make Lemonade by Wolf from 94. Which still circulates at my library. Out of the Dust by Hess from 97. I haven't pushed that in a long, long time. I might dig that out. Street Love by Myers. It's hard. Walter Dean Myers circulates a lot. He's just awesome. And What is Goodbye by Grimes from 2004. These are all some great titles and great entrees into the YA verse novels. Most of these are a little bit shorter than some of the other ones that are going to come up in a couple slides. All right, so I am a shameless dog person, and I will tell you that Love That Dog did make me cry by Sharon Creech. I have not read Hate That Cat or Heartbeat. But if you're interested in Sharon Creech, you can go to the Teach Creech website and see some of her lesson plans and activities to use with a book if you were to teach some Sharon Creech. And her writing is really emotionally evocative, especially if you're a dog person. Anyway, enjoy Sharon Creech a great deal. Okay, I will tell you that Ellen Hopkins is still super popular in my library. These books there's usually a gap on the shelf where these books sit because they are out all the time. I will tell you that I have not read them because I think I would be emotionally devastated by these. So they are the Crank novels series. Crank is based on her daughter's addiction to crystal meth. Like I said, I think this would devastate me and I don't want to read them, but I have kids read them all the time. So there's Crank, there's Fallout, there's Glass. I think there are other ones in this series. I should have put them on the slide. Flirting with the Monster. I don't think I have that one. Anyway, you can check out Ellen Hopkins' website. There are a bunch of them in the series, more than I have on here. And I will tell you that they are very appealing for kids who are looking for some drama, some realism, some super gritty realism. So Ellen Hopkins and her novels in verse. Biography is probably one of my least favorite genres or areas to read in. But then when I pick up a biography, I'm always surprised that I like it. So biography in verse is a lovely, lovely way to sort of coax someone into reading biography if they're not a big biography reader. Or if you have a teacher who assigns kids biography and they're reluctant. So, Becoming Billie Holiday by Weatherford from 2008. Carver, A Life in Poems by Nelson from 2001. The Poet Slave of Cuba, a biography of Juan Francisco Manzano by Engel in 2006. 12 Rounds to Glory, the story of Muhammad Ali by Smith in 2007. A Wreath for Emmett Till by Nelson in 2007. Our Own Sylvia, a verse portrait of Sylvia Plath by Hemphill in 2007. That was a Prince Honor book. So you have choices here and opportunities here to both promote the book in verse, but also get kids reading biography that might not be super excited about it. So this could definitely entice your reluctant biography readers. Right, so Kwame Alexander writes novels in verse, among other things, but he is very popular with young adults right now. I have a cute little story. I had a reluctant reader, an African-American male, check out Crossover not long ago, and he brought it back with the look of utter shock on his face several days later. He said, "I liked this." And it was such a nice response from a kid who was like, "I don't want to read it. I don't want to read it." And he came back and said, "Oh, I liked this." So I'm like, yay. So there's Crossover, which won the Newbery in 2015. It's perhaps slightly young, maybe a little bit young for high school. I don't really think so, though. There's Booked and Playbook. He was the recipient of the 2017 inaugural Pat Conroy Legacy Award, and he believes that poetry can change the world. You can go to the Library of Congress Poetry website if you need some ideas. They do a poem a day for high school students, which gives you 180 poems. Look, all of us, if you work in a school or even in a library, you have too much to do. It's hard to think. It's hard to keep on top of stuff. It's hard to create new promotions. It is hard to curate materials. So use this site, the Library of Congress Poetry website. Just make it part of your routine if you want to. If you have to do a morning news show, if you're in a school, you can add like a poem a day. Or you could look at the poems for the week and then pick one that you want to highlight on Friday or whatever you want to do. But anyway, they have chosen poems for you, a poem a day. From Billy Collins, a former poet laureate of the United States, to high school teachers of America. I want to acquaint you with a program for making poetry an active part of the daily experience of American high school students. The poem is called Poetry 180 and offers a poem for every day of the approximately 180-day school year. How the program is applied is completely up to each high school. I don't know why you couldn't just do this in a middle school also. You might want to review the poems ahead of time. You could probably use it in an elementary school as well, depending on the complexity of some of the poems. But, like I said, here is a way someone has created this already, curated it for you. The Library of Congress is pretty legit. It's probably a good source for poetry, so you might consider this or put this in your back pocket. If you work in a public library, this would be a great thing. Just print off the poem every day and put it up. Or find a book of poetry by that author of the day and display it next to the poem. That could be an ongoing, updated, easy thing for you to do. So why would teens like poetry in the first place? Poetry is a perfect medium for adolescence. It lends itself to the fierce dramas and false clarities of those years. Quote from Katie Roy from the New York Times Book Review. If you work with teens, they are absolutely dramatic. Woo! And they think they know everything. So there you go with false clarities. Wow, I have a 19-year-old that believes he knows absolutely everything. It gives opportunities for teens to publish online. There's all sorts of... See, poetry is... It's small enough chunks that it's less intimidating. So if kids want to publish stuff, there are online opportunities. And publishers issue collections of teen written work, including our wonderful public library here. The RCPL, Richland County Public Library, does a teen magazine every year. My high school does a lit mag. There are just opportunities for kids to get their poetry published in multiple different ways. So how do you keep interest in poetry alive in your library, public library, or your media center? Well, I love the fact that April is Poetry Month, because then it says to me that's when I do my biggest library or poetry promotions in my library. You can do a poetry break in libraries. You can use that Poetry 180 site and get a poem a day on your school news show. You can post poems around your school or around in your library, your public library. You can use technology to produce poetry. You can do Wordles or use cool fonts to produce or print out poetry. You could do programming and have visiting poets. Poetry Alive in Asheville, North Carolina. You can visit that site and see if there are poets that can come and visit you in your library or your school. The Voya Pure Poetry List or Voya's Poetry Picks can help you select things. And Voya has a poetry contest for teens. So there's another opportunity for kids to enter their poems or get them published. Some more ideas to make poetry alive for your patrons or your students. You can have a poetry coffee house and have students come in and read their own poetry or their favorite poets. You can have poetry writing contests, but God help me, I don't want to grade anything. So you will want to recruit other people to read with you. I highly suggest doing the magnetic poetry using cookie sheets. Last year I purchased, or maybe it's 2 years ago now, I purchased sets of magnetic poetry. I purchased 5 sets and 5 cookie trays. And then we have poetry writing contests. Like I'll have a class come in and we'll break up into groups. And each class has a timer and then has to write a poem, and they earn points based on the complexity of the poem. So a haiku will earn 1 point, and a limerick would earn 2 points, and a sonnet would earn like 5 points or something like that. So, but the magnetic poetry trays also just hang around and kids can make poems. And then if they make a cool poem that they like and they would like to share it, I will take a photograph of it and post it on my library Instagram. So I really, the magnetic poetry doesn't cost that much. It's like $100 investment, and then you've got it in your library. It's a cool thing to do, a cool activity using poetry. You can also make sure you diffuse poetry throughout your learning environment, whether it's a public library or a school library. So you could read on top of spaghetti in the cafeteria. You could make sure you've got sports poems posted in the gym. You could have science poems in your science labs. You could participate in a poem in a pocket day. Teachers and students have poems in their pockets that they can read aloud when asked. You can do bulletin boards that have to do promoting poetry books, poetry authors, or I did a poetry board that looks like magnetic poetry, but all the words have Velcro on the back. And then kids can create poems with the interactive bulletin board. You can do listening centers with poets reading their poems. And of course, I've mentioned this a couple times, if you're in a school and have to do daily announcements, I highly recommend having a poetry reading, a daily poem, the Read 180 or the Poetry 180 poems, or you can pick poems, or you can ask the kids to pick poems. Any way you want to do it, get some poetry up on those school announcements. It's a great way to incorporate poetry, especially if you choose shorter poems. But it's a great way to get more poetry exposure. You may want to sponsor a poetry slam. The competitive art of performance poetry, a dual emphasis on writing and performance, encourage poets to focus on what they're saying and how they're saying it. Poets perform their work and are judged by members of the audience. If you've never seen one, you try to pretend like you're a big old hipster, and when someone finishes, everybody snaps and they go, if they liked your poem particularly. I will tell you that one of my most favorite poetry slammers is a guy named Taylor Mali, M-A-L-I. If you've not heard of him, I highly recommend going to YouTube and look up What Teachers Make. He's kind of annoying in the first like 20 seconds of it, but give him a chance. What Teachers Make. Taylor Mali. He's awesome. I have used Taylor Mali as an example to get people in the mood, like to show to kids. And I have certainly done poetry slams in my library with drama and English classes. A couple other things you can do. Certainly do themed displays. Poetry concerning civil rights, Women's History Month, Earth Day, Native Americans. I mean, there's just all sorts of opportunity to incorporate groups, celebrate other things using poetry. You can certainly include poetry books in classroom sets. For some reason, my library, well, I assume this happens at other libraries as well. I seem to be some sort of lodestone for donated books, and so books show up, and some of them I don't want to add to my collection. So I have a book swap shelf in my library, so new teachers who come in who do not have a classroom library can come take stuff from the shelf, or people can drop off books that they've read but don't want to keep for that book swap shelf. Try to include some poetry available there. Try to make sure that your classroom sets have some sort of poetry in them. If you're involved in that at all and you're in a school, try to make sure you're putting poetry in your displays that are thematic, that aren't necessarily poetry displays, so it gets more exposure. You can encourage kids to write poetry. They can make list poems, animal list poems, acrostic poems, persona poems, concrete poems. If you don't remember what a concrete poem is, like if you're writing about a flower, it's in the shape of a flower. Like I said, when I do my poetry trays, acrostic poems are a possibility to score points. Also, haiku, limericks, sonnets. Be careful with limericks, particularly in high school. Wow, they get nasty. Anyway, you have all sorts of different poetry forms that kids can write. And sometimes a lot of kids like free verse or formless poems, but a lot of kids like the form and see it as sort of some kind of mathematical challenge to get the poetry to fit into the form. Ideas are available in Writing Poetry in the School Library and Reading It Too by Carla Wendelin. That's from School Library Monthly from April 2013. If you want more ideas, you can go look that one up. A recommended novel in verse would be Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. Jason Reynolds is incredibly hot now. You probably know this. He's showing up at all sorts of things like AASL. My sister met him last year. I think she went to AASL. I did a group reading or a read aloud of one of his books, All American Boys, 2 years ago now, and partnered with a class in New Hampshire as we read aloud and did some Skyping to discuss the book. But anyway, that's not Long Way Down. That was All American Boys. And so this Long Way Down is an ode to put the damn guns down. It was a National Book Award finalist and a New York Times bestseller. It's a fiercely stunning novel that takes place in 60 potent seconds, the time it takes a kid to decide whether or not he's going to murder the guy who killed his brother. The text is very terse. It's very fierce. It's very provocative. So I highly recommend Jason Reynolds stuff. I will tell you that students really engage with it. And the project I did reading All American Boys with a class in New Hampshire was also a really great experience because the class in New Hampshire had only one minority student in it. And the class I was working with here in Columbia, South Carolina was more than 50% minority. So the kids had very different perspectives. But Long Way Down, again, another powerful book by Jason Reynolds. I highly recommend his stuff and this book. Assignments, make sure you're reading chapters 14 and 15 in your textbook. I'm going to give you, I'll put up our a discussion board to give you an opportunity to comment on our textbook that will be due the week before everything else is due. But you don't have very many assignments left, so hopefully you're breathing a little bit more easily. I front-loaded most of our assignments, so the semester you should be able to coast to the end. Your book talks, narratives, and podcasts or vodcasts are due by midnight tomorrow, November 15th. Hopefully I've answered most of your questions. I'm going to go get on our discussion board to make sure I answer anything else. Please be calm. I hope you have figured out that I am not a super picky grader. If you're in the ballpark, you will do fine. Final lit logs are due by midnight on December 6th. I assume you're doing fine with those. Also, the fact that there's just not a lot due in the next couple of weeks. And you don't have an exam. Take a deep breath, y'all. You're almost there. You are almost there. Like I said, I tried to front load, so the next few weeks you can breathe. You can catch up on your reading if you have bailed on it for a little bit. Hopefully you can get through several novels a week so you can finish up those lit logs. Also, when you're doing your lit logs, which I know you're not onto yet, but when you do them, please put the text for the second half of the semester in a different color. That will be helpful to me. All right, so I hope you're all doing well. I'll be online for a bit tonight, a little bit later, to answer questions or email me directly. I may respond directly from my phone, which is a little bit against protocol, but I want to make sure if you have questions that I'm a little quicker to respond. All right. I hope you're doing well. You're almost there. Keep your chins up. Keep reading. All right. Ciao. Oh yeah, and no class next week. And email me if you've got questions. All right. Have a good week, y'all. Bye.